what I want to do is see if we're going to have to get a new timing chain. As you can see, this timing chain is actually rather sloppy on there, but there actually is a specification for this. It's called chain deflection. So I need a couple of things here from my toolbox. Hang on. All right, so what I've got is a magnet and ruler. And what I'm going to do is rotate the engine backwards to take up slack on the right side. Oh man, never rotate an engine backwards. That's a thumbs down because the Haynes manual says you should never do that. Yeah, well, I'm working with an engine, not a clock spring, so I'm not too worried about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this magnet, oops, well, it's going to have to hold in place if this is going to work. There we go. And I want to put it up kind of in the middle between the sprockets. And that gives me a point of reference to put my ruler. And what I'm doing here is, let's see, let's put the inch side here so it's easy. I'm going to put my ruler there and hold it flat, and I'm going to push on the tense side, and we go and we read 1/2 of an inch. It reads right at exactly at 1/2 of an inch. So I'm going to remember that setting, and now I'm going to go into the clockwise rotation to take up the slack on the right side. I'm sorry, the left side now, and that loosens this up quite a bit. And from my point of reference, I'm going to check the deflection, and now it reads 1/4 of an inch. So by subtracting the 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch, I actually have only 1/4 of an inch of deflection, and specification on this engine is 1/2 an inch. So I actually do not have to replace the timing chain on this engine. However, from that company, Engine Tech, not that I'm sponsoring them or anything, but they do, you know, they do get the job done for a pretty low price. A timing set is only like $30. So we're going to tentatively put that on our list. And if we can fit this within our budget, I would like to get a new timing set. I'm not overly concerned about it because on this particular engine, it is very, very easy on these 40, 50-year-old vehicles to access the front of the engine and replace a timing set within an hour and a half maybe or something of work. So anything internal in the engine, that's a different story, but this I can live with. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and remove the timing set and the camshaft. All right, now these camshaft bolts can be really, really tight on later model engines. I don't expect it to be a problem on this one, but on later model engines, if you don't have an impact gun, what you're going to probably have to do, because as you turn that bolt, the engine's going to want to turn over. Since we've got the oil pan off, you can stick a block of wood between the crankshaft throws and the block to jam up your crankshaft, and that'll give you resistance so that you can loosen this bolt. But these can be a real pain. All right, that wasn't too bad on this engine. When you take these off, be careful. Sometimes there's washers behind them and stuff, so you want to maintain everything as a unit. And we should be able, the sprocket for the crankshaft should just walk on the keyway here, and then this should just come off, and there we go. And now we can remove our chain and sprocket set. This is a camshaft retainer. These bolts also on later model engines can be extremely tight. Some models of engines, instead of bolts, they actually use countersunk Allen screws, which almost always strip. I don't know why they do that, but these can be a little bit of a pain. Make sure that you, you know, don't round them off if you're dealing with Allen screws or something. And one of the things I'm going to do, I'm not totally sure whether this is going to be superimposable, but I want to make sure that I put this retainer on the same way that I took it off, so I'm going to do something. Just going to put a little paint mark on the outside so that I know that this side faces out. Okay, there we go. And to get this camshaft out, I'm going to have to get a long bolt that will thread in there and use it as a handle. So this one actually seems to do quite nicely. So now what we want to do, I'm not worried about destroying the bearings, removing the camshaft this way. An ideal way of doing this would be to flip the engine over, remove your pistons and crankshaft, and then you can reach in with your other hand and remove this with the engine upside down using two hands. But the thing is, my rebuild kit is going to come with new camshaft bearings, which I'm going to use and replace the old camshaft bearings anyway. So I'm really not worried about scratching up the bearings at this stage. And quite honestly, I'll be shocked if this camshaft is in any condition that it doesn't need to be machined anyway. All right, and the trick is to kind of keep it as straight as you can and just walk through the bearings one at a time. And you can sometimes look through the oil holes here and kind of monitor your progress a little bit. There we go. There's the next one, and it just kind of comes out sort of in sections a little bit. And there's the next one. That one's a little snug there. There we go. Putting this in, you want to be considerably more gentle than this. And incidentally, if you've never done camshaft, you can see the camshaft bearing right here. Let's take a closer look at this. But one thing to keep in mind, counterintuitive to most people, the bearings for the camshaft are actually not interchangeable. When you get your new camshaft bearings, they are going to be numbered and they go into specific locations in the block. So just keep that in mind, and we'll cover that when we install the camshaft bearings. You don't just take the camshaft bearings out of the box and just pop them in any order. They go in a specific order, so you really need to pay attention to that. Let's go ahead and look at our camshaft first, and much to my amazement, it absolutely looks amazing. I absolutely cannot believe it. Let's see. Well, okay, I take that back. I just noticed this area right here where this journal is chipped up pretty good right at this location here. You can see that that's not grease, that is a chip. So, well, that's going to be a problem because it's well into the journal area, and that's not going to be something that can be machined. So it looks like we are in a little trouble here. Other than that, this totally passes my fingernail test with flying colors. It looks absolutely great, but we somehow have some damage there. That might explain that big chip of metal that I saw in the oil pan when I first removed it. Well, looks like we'll be adding a camshaft now to our list, and that means also lifters, so this kind of sucks. Here's a close-up of our camshaft bearing, and much to my amazement, it's actually fairly smooth. Can't quite explain that, but it actually passes the fingernail test too. Well, at least in some areas. Some areas I can feel some catch, but it's not nearly like that rod bearing was. So anyway, we'll pull those bearings out later. What we're going to do now is flip the engine over, and all we've got left is the pistons and crankshaft. And we'll do some inspections and see if we continue to do this pattern, which is very, very common, of adding up more and more expenses as you continue on further into the engine. All the more reason that you want to make sure you do all your measurements before you spend any money, buy any parts, take anything to the machine shop. You want to do all this up front. And this engine is much, much lighter now with all of the heavy cylinder heads and intake removed. So anyway, one thing, by the way, you'll notice it's kind of interesting for me, at least, when I'm talking about things like fuel trims and understanding the interpretation of oxygen sensor data, and then somebody in the comments will ask, hey, what's that brand of gloves that you wear, and whatever. But one of the things that I think maybe some people will notice, this little drip pan that is custom made for the engine stand. I'm sure I'm going to get some people asking about that. I also got that from Summit Racing. It's only like 40 bucks, worth its weight in gold. It totally catches all the fluids and drips when you do this kind of work. Highly recommend getting one, totally worth it. A good place to start with the bottom is removal of the oil pump. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and take this apart because I know a lot of people may not have seen the innards of a oil pump. It's actually extraordinarily simple, just a couple planetary gears really. But all this is moot. There are specifications for an oil pump as far as clearances and things, but it doesn't matter because we're always going to use a new oil pump anyway. And so there are, if we can see in here, we'll zoom you in. So as you can see, and the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to make a point really, but also I know some people are like, oh man, he's taking apart an oil pump. I can watch this all day. Yeah, that's awesome. But you can see the point that I want to make is how simple these designs are. And there are specifications for example, the clearances between the inner gear and the outer one, and also clearances between the gears and the lid. But we're not going to worry about all those because you would get a new pump anyway. There's no point, in my opinion, of checking these. But what my main point is a lot of times when you have low oil pressure, and it is confirmed low oil pressure, it's not a faulty low oil pressure light or something like that, you have low engine oil pressure, you can see that the odds that it is a fault with the oil pump are going to be extremely minimal because these are incredibly simple. Almost always what it is the oil pump is delivering plenty of oil, but the bearing clearances are so wide that you never build up pressure. So now hopefully that you see this, that will be clear to you to not change an oil pump when you have low oil pressure. You need to check your bearing clearances because changing the oil pump is probably not going to fix it. Hopefully that's clear to you now. Oh man, there's bolts turning. This is awesome. How easily entertained the masses are. So there goes our oil pump. And now what we're going to do is before I start getting all excited and removing pistons, I want to do some boring stuff. I'm so sorry, ADD Haynes manual jockeys, but I want to measure some clearances while I'm here. And before I take everything apart, because it'll be my only chance to do that, I can't do it with things taken apart. And what I want to measure is, if we look at these connecting rods, there is a very little bit of play where the two connecting rods are between the crankshaft throws here. And there is actually a specification for this. And at this point, especially considering that we are tallying up some expenses on our budget rebuild, I want to look for anything that's going to be kind of a fatal decision maker where it's going to be such a repair that we're not going to be able to do this rebuild. And so what I'm going to do is place a feeler gauge at the specification on my spec sheet. And it'll vary greatly between models, but we are within spec on that play there. If we were not, if these were too tight together, then we've got some machine shop work to do on either the crankshaft and or the rods to get them within spec. And if there's too much slop, too much loose play, well, now we've got a real problem. This may mean that we may need a new crankshaft. It may mean we need new connecting rods, which would basically amount to new pistons, really. So I like to measure that before I take things apart. But we're in spec here, so we're looking more and more like we'll be able to reuse these pistons, which is a good sign. All right, removing pistons. And if you've never done this before, then don't give me a negative comment for the way that I do it because it's different than what you read. You can always tell the Haynes manual jockeys on my channel. You know why? They're the very, very low percentage that give me negative thumbs downs on my videos. So what I'm doing is I'm rotating the crankshaft to bring the throw to the highest position so I can easily access my bolts. But there's going to be a very important thing here. There's a couple very important things. One of them is the pistons are going to have to be relocated exactly in the same location that we pulled them from. You cannot just relocate the pistons in any location. Piston number 2 has to go back into position number 2. And as I said earlier, in the right orientation with the front of the piston facing the front of the engine. So there's another thing too, and that is when I remove the rod cap, it's going to have to go back onto the exact orientation that I pulled it off of. So what I am going to do is mark the rod cap so there is no possibility that I can invert the rod cap when I reassemble this. If you do that, your rebuild is not going to work. Most likely you'll discover that that's happened because you won't be able to rotate the crankshaft even, but this is a very, very important detail to pay attention to, so I will show you what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is on one side of my cap, I'm going to punch a number. In this case, this is number 6. And then I'm going to do it on the other, on the connecting rod side. And that way I know which ends match together. And the other thing too is just in case I won't be able to clean the piston head enough, the crown enough to see the orientation mark on the crown on which direction the piston goes back. I always mark the sides facing up. So when I put this back together, I still have a backup either way to ensure that my pistons are reinstalled in exactly the same way I took them apart. Now, before I remove the pistons, one issue I'm going to have is there's often a big, thick ring of carbon at the very top here where the rings don't quite scrape up against. So by using some carburetor cleaner, and I'm going to use a razor blade, I'm going to scrape that carbon ring off, and there we go. The idea is hopefully this will help to prevent breaking the piston rings when I push them through, or any damage to the piston, which I intend on reusing if at all possible. So it pays to take your time to go through and get that carbon ring off. All right, now I can remove my connecting rod cap nuts. And I want to just keep them threaded on just a little bit for a minute here. And what I'm going to do is just gently tap with a hammer to break the cap loose like that. Now I can remove the nuts all the way. And one thing I'm a little bit overly cautious maybe, I like to place the nuts back onto the original locations in the same orientation that I pulled them off to ensure that I get accurate torque readings. So I'm going to carefully set these aside so that I can reassemble this thing. And then I'm going to remove the cap. And I'm going to place the cap aside. And then what I'm going to do is, this will be something that's important also on the reinstallation. This journal is actually rather rough, so I'm not all that worried about the bolts for the connecting rod damaging the journal by rubbing against it. But what I do want to avoid is those bolts dragging across the cylinder wall. So what I'm going to do to protect both the crankshaft, were it a concern, and the cylinder walls, is I'm going to put on these little rubber hoses that I've cut, and I've put a little bit of a curve into them. So I'm going to put the curve to the outside. And what this is going to do is when I push the piston through, it's going to center the connecting rod in the bore so that it won't scrape up my cylinder walls. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reach in with my hand and be prepared to catch the piston when it comes out on this side. And I'm going to use the wooden end of a hammer to tap this through. And the compression rings are going to make this a little bit kind of sticky in there. But there it goes. Now, once I get this piston clear of the crankshaft, what I may have to do, and I am going to have to do it in this case, is I'm going to rotate the crankshaft out of my way. Like that, so I can get the hammer either onto the wrist pin or onto the bearing on the connecting rod right there. And then I'm going to very gently, once I find where the piston is, where is that? Oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to very gently push the piston, checking very carefully. There goes our first ring. There it goes. And now my little protectors are hugging the walls so that I'm not scraping up my walls with my connecting rod. And there goes. All right. And it's not uncommon to break one of the rings, one of the compression rings, when it punches through there. So don't worry too much about it, because you're going to want to re-ring your pistons anyway. I'm going to check my markings that I just made, and I'm going to put this back on there and then lightly thread the nuts on. And now I need to store this piston so that I can know which piston it is. Obviously my stamped numbers are going to help, but what I find useful is this right here. This is just simply a 2-liter soda tray that I got at the supermarket, and I've just labeled front on there. So let's see here. I pulled the piston. Sometimes you got to have a little bit of spatial reasoning skills here. So that is going to go into this location right there. So this way, when I load my pistons in, it's very easy for me to put them back into the correct locations. All right, and as I go through and remove the rest of my pistons here, I want to bring up another couple of points real quick. One of them is there's no need to check the clearances, the oil clearances for the bearings, especially on this engine, because we know for a fact that the bearings are completely worn, they're going to be out of spec. But in another video on how to find a good salvage yard engine, I go through the use of plasti gauge, and we will do that on the reassembly, absolutely. But it's a way to measure to see if you're within spec for your bearing oil clearances. And there's no need to do this on this engine, again, because we know the bearings are shot. We're not going to be anywhere near spec. And of course, we know we need to grind the crankshaft anyway. So no need to do that. You would always use new bearings when you get to this point, regardless. And speaking of that, I wanted to bring up a very, very often asked question on some of my other videos where we've got basically a destroyed engine. And a lot of people that are in that situation ask, can't I just buy new rod bearings and replace the bearings where I have rod knock by just getting under the car, removing the oil pan, removing the caps on the rod, push the piston up out of the way, get the old bearings out if they're even there, replace with new bearings, put it all back together, and avoid a rebuild? And it's a definite rational thought, but the answer is a resounding no. You cannot do that, and there's multiple reasons why. Not the least of which, if you have rod knock, you absolutely are not going to be able to do that, because the journal on the crankshaft is going to be so chewed up that when you put the new bearings in, remember, you're going to have much more compression now with the new bearings, but you have an incredibly rough surface. The friction is going to be so much that as soon as you start the engine, you're going to spin the bearings. And spinning the bearings is when the two halves of the bearing overlap each other. When that happens, you're going to freeze the crankshaft, you're going to freeze your engine up. It's going to be much harder to remove the engine. It's a terrible idea. So if you have rod knock, do not do it. Now, one of the other things on this engine where there was no rod knock and the bearings are still present, can we get away with that? Well, again, still the answer is no. As we see, even though the journals are not totally chewed up, we would still have enough friction that if we didn't spin a bearing, we would still take off a considerable amount of bearing material right away. All that metal is going to flow through the engine. It would be a very short-lived repair at best. And then the final thing is, remember, the oil is going to be full of metal. All of the galleys are full of metal. The oil pump is full of metal. So even if you did that, you're still, even if you change the oil and the filter, you're still cycling metal through the engine. It would be a very temporary repair at best. So really, once you get to the point that you have to do an engine rebuild, you can't just replace bearings and call it a day. It's not nearly that simple. So let me go ahead and get the rest of these pistons out, and then we're going to go ahead and do a measurement on the crankshaft and then remove the crankshaft and inspect it. All right, got my last piston out. One of the things we'll want to do is kind of examine the piston, and what I want to do is clean it off a little bit, and we can see that if we look here, there are scratches on the piston skirt here, and I can definitely catch those with my fingernail. So that's going to be a problem, because even after I hone the cylinder bore, that's going to definitely mark up the cylinder wall, and that is definitely going to create some more wear. Now remember, I'm willing to get away with some things, like for example on this side of the piston there's a little bit of scuffing, but it totally passes my fingernail test. I would have let that go. Again, with an extreme budget, we're going to produce an engine that, you know, admittedly maybe has the equivalent of, you know, several thousand miles on it, maybe 20, 30,000 miles even. But what I don't want to do is go through all this work and put together an engine that is going to be out of spec, and basically you rebuild the engine to create an engine that is in need of a rebuild if you were to do compression tests on it or something. Something like this is of major concern, and also it looks like it's actually deep enough. I'm worried about it cracking. Well, that's going to be kind of a problem. It looks like we may have some new pistons in our future. More stuff to add up, so we'll go ahead and put this in my little holder, but this rebuild is looking less and less low budget, and to be honest with you, in my experience, that's actually pretty typical. Okay, at this point we are going to remove the crankshaft. The crankshaft should be very easy to turn, but we already know that we need to resurface this crankshaft at the machine shop, so I'm not too worried about taking too many specs. But before I remove the crankshaft, there is one spec that I do want to measure. I want to check the end play. And what that's going to do is the crankshaft end play is basically the side to side, or actually more front to back play that the crankshaft has. And there will be a specification for that. And that is controlled by your thrust bearings, and I'll show you those when I remove the crankshaft. But basically, like the rod bearings, the crankshaft is pinched between some main caps and the block, and there are bearings that are pinching on the crankshaft journals. But some of the bearings actually have bearings on the sides as well, and I'll show this to you, and that controls your play. If the end play is so sloppy that I know that new bearings would not be enough to fix it, well, then we've got a rather serious issue that we would have to deal with. So again, I'm trying to look for anything that's kind of fatal. That would be a major expense that would put us well out of the budget and would end this project. So I'm going to go ahead and check that end play, so I'll show you how to do that. What I have here is a dial indicator set up at the end of the crankshaft, and what I'm going to do is use a rubber hammer on one of these crankshaft throws to make sure that I set the crankshaft all the way to the back of the block as much as I can. And I'm going to zero my gauge to that point.